Welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Indian Ocean World podcast. My name is Philip Gooding. I am a postdoctoral fellow at the Indian Ocean World Centre at McGill University. Today I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Emily Brownell, a lecturer in environmental history and African history at Edinburgh University. Dr. Brownell received a PhD in these disciplines from the University of Texas at Austin in 2012 and has spent time as an assistant professor at the University of Northern Colorado and as a visiting scholar at the Max Planck Institute for the History of Science. She is the author of several book chapters and journal articles, including in publications such as Current Anthropology, Global Environment, and Environmental History. She is currently working on a project entitled Stories from the Substrate, which aims to narrate East African history from the soil through a variety of case studies of how people, animals, and plants have made and remade the region in the last century. Today, she has joined us to discuss her book, Gone to Ground, A History of Environment and Infrastructure in Dar es Salaam, which was published in 2020 with the University of Pittsburgh Press. Dr. Brownell, thank you very much for joining us.
And thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here virtually.
Absolutely, virtually. Just to start off, could you just please discuss your book, Gone to Ground? What were your inspirations? What were your aims? What were you hoping to contribute to the historiography? Or essentially, what is the significance of going to ground in the environmental history of Dar es Salaam?
Yeah, sure. So I'm always a little jealous when people have good origin stories for their projects. I don't know that I necessarily do. As a grad student, I was trying to figure out what my project should be and was kind of struggling quite a bit. I thought at first I wanted to do a project on specifically waste and waste histories someplace in urban Africa. And I didn't necessarily settle on Tanzania out of any sort of particular intellectual pursuit at first. I think I was interested in Tanzania as socialist history. I also think that the historiography of Dar es Salaam is really vibrant. So I was able to sort of picture the city in a lot of ways when learning about it from the classroom. So I went there thinking I wanted to do a project on waste to kind of survey the landscape and survey the archives. And I kind of got stuck when I got there. I didn't really know how I was going to make that project work. I think I was a bit seduced by the kind of metaphors of waste and the metaphors of thinking with waste. And then when I actually got there and was kind of looking at the archives, I didn't know how I would really make a substantial project out of that would do something new. But I was still interested in kind of thinking about materials and environments in the city. And so from there, I sort of scoped out and thought, okay, what would it look like to do an urban environmental history of Dar es Salaam? And when I looked for models of that, I couldn't really find any that had been done of an African city. And even more broadly, I had a tough time finding monographs in environmental history. Obviously, other disciplines had tackled similar subjects like geographers and anthropologists, but a monograph in environmental history about a sort of quote unquote global South city. So that's kind of became my starting point, was what would it look like to do that, to write an environmental history from Dar es Salaam. And, you know, quite ambitiously, I think my initial inspiration was probably Cronin's Nature's Metropolis. Like, what would it be to think, I think specifically what I liked about Cronin's book was this idea of thinking about the material of city making. So I wasn't as interested in thinking about categories of nature or thinking about nature and what it means and definitions of it. I was very nervous of sort of importing a lot of Western ideas if I did that in this project, because I didn't necessarily find it in my archives. So I wanted to do then a sort of, you know, provisioning story a bit of how did, you know, the hinterlands and the periphery of Dar es Salaam sort of make the city. so that was maybe the first jumping off point for me. I also became quite stuck on doing the 1970s and the 1980s. So for an environmental history, I actually think my book takes on a very small chunk of time. I think one of the things that environmental historians do really admirably is to take on really large chunks of time and narrate them historically. But I think I was really interested in actually just focusing on the 70s and basically the end of the socialist era, which comes in 1985 when President Nyerere steps down. The problem is that's a period that's incredibly hard to find in the National Archives in Tanzania. So all of a sudden, me thinking, oh, gee, no one's done this before, like, let me do this. It became quite clear why a lot of people have not tackled that time period as much, and there's more work focused on the 1960s. So it took, me sort of figuring out, okay, I need to ask people about this. I need to do some oral histories. I need to, read newspapers. And of course, that's not a novel idea in Tanzanian historiography. Newspapers for Tanzania are an incredibly vibrant source, and a lot of people have turned to them and made such good work out of reading newspapers. So I thought I could pull it off in the end if I sort of gathered an archive from a bunch of different places and use, a fair amount of gray literature, as I say in here. So kind of policy documents and reports and case studies as well to talk about the urban environment in Dar on top of the newspapers and the oral history. I'd say that's kind of where I started or sort of began writing my dissertation. Was, okay, I'm going to take these, I'm going to talk about how people come to the city. I'm going to talk about housing. I'm going to talk about food. I'm going to talk about waste. I was profoundly dissatisfied with my dissertation when it was done, and it took me a while to get excited about it again. And I think my time at Max Planck really helped shape what is now the book. So I went from these kinds of familiar categories, which are still there, obviously, I think, in the construction of the book, but tried to figure out what angle I wanted to take on the particular chapters and abandoned any sense of needing to do, I think, a more traditional environmental history of the city. So I said, okay, what's exciting for me in these newspapers and in this stuff, and how can I kind of shape chapters that I think narrate how someone living in Dar es Salaam in the 1970s and 80s might have engaged with their environment and thought about it. And it wasn't, really about the environment, but it was about how do you live in a city at a time when the state is really withdrawing much in terms of establishing or developing infrastructure. How do you make life possible in very fundamental ways? So that's kind of how I think things shifted from my dissertation to the book project, was how can I make each chapter thematically touch on what I imagine to be a sort of profound struggle in people's lives in the city during the time period I was looking at. And so that's when I kind of theorized and came up with the idea of going to ground, which the title comes from a book by J.A.K. Leslie called A Survey of Dar es Salaam, written in the beginning of the 1960s. It's this kind of unusual social survey of the city. That's a really interesting document of like the late 50s and early 60s. And in it, he casually says that, people Africans who live in the city frequently don't stay there all of the time, but they quote unquote go to ground in the periphery. And he's specifically using that term to talk about kind of hiding out from authorities, trying to evade being captured and sent into rural areas. And that it struck me that this was actually profoundly and precisely what African urbanization was, is this kind of routine process of settling and unsettling in the city. And that in order to sort of make a living, you cobble together wage work, informal selling often, but also a a significant reliance on what you can get from the region and from the environment in the periphery, and how you can sort of extract that and bring it into the city. So Gone to Ground came together for me as meaning this kind of ongoing process of negotiating opportunities and struggles in the city and seeking out material relief in rural resources. So that was one definition. And then I realized that there were a couple other I also wanted to play off of. And another one was what happens in the city in the 70s and 80s when infrastructures that people rely on to get rid of waste, to travel to work, to get food, what happens when they are grounded, literally when they go offline, as they frequently do during this period, and increasingly into the 1980s. Long periods where water isn't accessible to people, electricity certainly, and food is provisioned in a lot of different ways. So what happens when these infrastructures are grounded? And then lastly, on a sort of more hopeful note, I think, even though it's kind of becomes an impossibility by the 1980s, what do these experiences prompt in terms of rethinking nation building and development in Tanzania? And actually, how do they kind of prompt an effort, even though it comes too late and is kind of thwarted by structural adjustment? How do these efforts prompt a thinking about a more grounded or from the ground up form of development that relies more on natural resources in Tanzania? So that's kind of a broad overview of what Gone to Ground means to me and sort of where it came from.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Brownell. It's an absolutely fascinating book. And thank you for summarizing it and some of the key themes that you've drawn on right there. I've got a couple of questions which kind of come to mind. One of them is this possible wider applicability of going to ground or gone to ground. I think you explain in your book that Dar es Salaam has some distinctive features in its history in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly as a result of the broader ideology of Ujamaa. But I wondered, to what extent do you think this idea of going to ground has wider applicability? Is this something that you possibly envisage could be something that could be applied or developed in other post-colonial African cities, or even colonial ones as well?
Yeah. I certainly hope it resonates with people who work in other African cities, but also just even anywhere in the world to some degree. I think that, yes, you're correct, that there is something very specific about this idea in Dar es Salaam, and I'll give you very quickly the context of that being that, of course, this is in the era of Ujamaa, where President Nyerere has, starting in 1967, announced the project of villagization, as I'm sure a lot of listeners will know about. But the village and sort of rural life is what is being particularly valorized in Tanzania during this period. And the state also enacts several different operations, as they're called, to try and extract people that they see as living in the city but unemployed and sort of not contributing to the nation state, to try and get them to decamp and live on the outside and on the periphery. And through this, the state frequently orders people to farm on the outskirts of the city. So there is something very specific about sort of going to ground about Tanzanian politics and this political moment in the 70s and 80s, where it's not just people for their own needs going to kind of get resources from the periphery, but the state is also actually enforcing people to do it to a large extent. And even corporations are having to do this, right? So banks have to start farms on the outside of town in order to sort of subsidize the livelihoods of their employees. So there's something very profoundly specific about that for Dar, but I think it's I hope it resonates, like I say, with people who work in other places to kind of, I think, capture a particular way that we should see urban space and cities in Africa writ large. Let's just say that for now, even though I think it could be a more, it goes beyond just African cities, but that, first of all, frequently, as opposed to what we might call urban development in the West, that cities across the continent have generally been developed by the people who live in it, that there's not a lot of profound infrastructural development that have happened sometimes via the state. That's not always true, but that's an artifact of colonial rule, where infrastructures were quite small in urban spaces, and definitely designated mostly for Europeans. So there's this obvious need for people to be able to provision for their lives in the periphery that I think over time is what constructs a lot of African cities. And as I talk about in my first chapter, that makes the designation, or this idea of the sort of formal and the informal parts of cities, to be problematic if we think about them as kind of opposites, because actually the informal parts of cities, quote unquote, where Africans during the colonial period were sort of relegated to live and to make homes, and then, of course, that sort of expands in the post-colonial period, that those are actually the parts of the city that often provision for the rest of the city. And so they are absolutely interdependent rather than kind of opposing parts of the city. There's no way for the formal city to survive without the informal periphery. So I think that should resonate with a lot of people who work on African cities, and that to capture the kind of environmental aspect of that. There's, of course, lots of other aspects to it. That gone to ground might be a useful heuristic, a useful way to think about the process by which cities are constructed.
Wonderful. You touch on one thing which I think is very persuasive. Of course, that the Tanzanian government was very much with Ujamaa was focused on, had an ideological drive to villagize from 1967. And this resulted in the breaking up of Dar es Salaam into different administrative districts instead of being governed as one urban space. And again, that this was about an ideology also rooted in the idea of self-help. I find that, of course, this is to a certain degree, the idea of self-help in Ujamaa is well established. I wondered in the Dar es Salaam case, but what is there a point at which this idea of self-help isn't about pushing an ideology, but about capacity? One of the things that really struck me in your book was about their response to the cholera epidemic in 1978, by which time the Tanzanian state is, well, really struggling. In the aftermath of the OPEC crisis, at the aftermath of the drought in the mid-1970s. And their response is essentially self-help yourselves. Again, is this still ideologically driven as it had been earlier in the decade, or is this about we just can't do anything about this anymore? Or do these kind of things meet somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I would say they meet somewhere in the middle. I think I would be in trouble to presume that Ujamaa ideology was all about practicality. But I do think that we see that creep in by, in some respects, the early 70s, and definitely by the 80s. And I think that the way in which people had to basically provision for themselves in the city is a good way to think about that. So I don't know that I think that we can ultimately disentangle the command to farm in the cities from sort of the ideological project of Ujamaa. You know, you have these books and these films that are telling people, you know, your rightful place is in the country farming. You should be doing this. But I also think that Narrate is quite honest in many regards with the public. Of course, it's to his own, I think, desired ends to be honest in this regard, but he's quite honest about how fragile the Tanzanian economy and future is. And so he does ask people to sort of, you know, farm their own food, to sort of provision for themselves, because I think it is a sort of practicality. I think a good example of how this plays out might be in my second chapter, or I guess it might be my third chapter, but my chapter on building materials. That, you know, at the beginning of independence, Nyerere makes a point of establishing a cement plant. And I think we might quite easily understand the sort of valences of cement in the third world, right? It's this very practical building material. It's incredibly important to the quite actual material process of nation building for post-colonial nations, and it's quite expensive to import. So I think cement probably had this kind of ideological framing when the cement plant is first established in the late 1960s and starts operating. But then, because of the oil crisis and how expensive oil is to get, it becomes impossible to, you know, produce that much cement. And the cement plant starts going into kind of chronic disrepair because of the need of spare parts as well as oil. So then all of a sudden, you know, the state starts to support and really sort of proselytize building out of burnt bricks instead. The burnt brick I see in the newspapers is an ideological thing. It's this, okay, if we get together, if we can build our own kiln in every village, we can use the, you know, mud under our feet, and we can make our own bricks. So this becomes something that sort of, I think, symbolizes Ujamaa, but I also think it was absolutely just a practical shift where you all of a sudden had a bunch of people who had, you know, in Nyerere's eyes, come to fetishize cement. Cement was a sign of modernity. It was a building material that was going to uplift, that was going to make these permanent homes. And now you had to sort of eschew that and say, no, you know, what you need is burnt bricks instead. So I think that actually captures pretty well this kind of pivot that happens in the 70s and 80s that is sort of all bound together, both practicality and ideology.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought attention to your chapter on materializing the nation. That's it's a real highlight and pioneering aspect of the book. I want to kind of pivot now to something that you haven't mentioned yet, but I think that features really strongly throughout your book, and this is changing gender dynamics. So many interesting dichotomies you draw on in the book. You mentioned the fact that the state, the post-colonial and the colonial, demonized single women in the city as tearing families apart. Also had the fact that the post-colonial state is encouraging people to farm for themselves, and this largely fell on women's shoulders in Dar es Salaam, even though I think the Ujamaa ideal was for men to be doing the farming. I could go on, but basically, I think just from these examples, I wondered what you thought about how did Ujamaa and how it was kind of implemented in Dar es Salaam seek to reinforce or change gender relations, and to what extent or in what ways did women and men transgress these ideals?
That's a good question, and I think it goes kind of under analyzed in my book, frankly. And I'm a little shy answering it just because I know there's so many people who work on DAR and touch on gender so much more expertly than I do. But I do think it's important for it to be for gender and environment and gender and environmental history to be just, sort of thought about in this context. And I think it comes out particularly because my book focuses on provisioning. So I think if I had thought about maybe other forms of engagements with landscape, the role of women specifically, and I'm sort of doing the bad thing of conflating women and gender right here, but women come through in the book because I think I'm focusing on how households basically are able to get what they need at the end of the day. And so often that falls on women. And so it actually does a nice job of showing how women both transform the landscape of Dar in certain ways, and also how they take advantage of the transformed landscape in Dar. So I'll focus on those two things really quickly. One, you're absolutely right. I think it's mostly women who are kind of the member of the family that are going to go and cultivate a small plot of land outside of Dar es Salaam while their husband works in the city or even works, somewhere else. They might also go all the way back to their village if the village is nearby and tend to a farm there that would then, bring in the food into the city from there. So I would say they're kind of very influential in sort of shaping this kind of a semi-rural periphery around Dar and using that as a way to sort of sustain life in the city. They're also the ones that seem to be doing a lot of the provisioning in black markets and going to markets and trying to figure out where you can find food when you can't get it from your normal sources. And so they sort of get to know the landscape of the city this way. And for the most part, these women are going to be walking the city, right? They are, in my chapter on waiting for the bus, I talk about how the bus in particular could be a really sort of tough place to try and get on. To get on the bus and to go somewhere could be either expensive or simply a kind of competitive, like physically competitive thing to get a seat on the bus. So a lot of women are just taking up space in the landscape of Dar, walking to and from and sort of gathering things for their lives. I would say where they take advantage of the transformed landscape of the city is that and this actually ties specifically in with that chapter on waiting for the bus, as the transportation infrastructure in Dar becomes much more fragmented and basically a bunch of buses are in disrepair and can't run anymore. So you have a city that's kind of constantly waiting for the bus to get to work or to get home. Women come into those spaces and take them up, as we know, as anyone who's really gone to a city in Africa can attest. There's a lot of spaces for informal selling, and that's not just space for women, but I think they in particular find those spaces and kind of take them over and take advantage of the fact that the failing bus system means that people are going to be in these spaces and that they will be able to kind of sell to them in those spaces. So I think they do. I think in that way, women are also shaping the landscape of the city and coming into these places that have been altered by the sort of infrastructural collapse and finding ways to make it to their advantage. So some of the women that I interviewed, you can I think it's also a sort of common thing to hear, but frequently their work in the informal sector, selling donuts or, something like that, is equally or even more lucrative than their husband's work, especially by the 1980s when wages are really depressed. And so those become really important ways to also provision for families. And like I say, I think sort of transform the landscape of the city as they're doing that. I'd say the final thing on gender dynamics that I don't really touch on and I didn't learn enough about, but I think it's worth pursuing a bit is charcoal. So charcoal as a fuel is a particularly urban fuel. For the most part, people in rural areas use just firewood, so not something that has been transformed into charcoal. And firewood collecting tends to be women's work. And I think that happens on the periphery of Dar and these kind of villages that make up the edges of the city. There's still the possibility of collecting firewood for, into maybe the 70s and 80s. But then the charcoal industry really takes out, and I think the charcoal industry is a much more male-dominated form of energy and energy sector. I don't know that this is true across the board, but I think that is an interesting gender dynamic too, this kind of firewood versus charcoal difference. I didn't learn enough about that to really draw it out in the book at all, but I'd love it if someone else did.
Yeah, that's you mentioned in that last answer the failing bus system. You talked about infrastructural collapse. One of the words that you've avoided, and you make a point of avoiding in the book as much as you can, is the word crisis. And in your conclusion, you make a very provocative and well-grounded, I should say, provocative in this instance is not a bad thing, of course. You challenging Africanist historians and some of the language and literature used by them, particularly because of their use of the word crisis. And kind of in response, you say, and this is a quote, "I'm interested in failure as process, not as diagnostic." And I just wanted to know, what did you mean? What do you specifically mean by this? Just for our listeners, so that they can understand your own views on this. And also, how does this kind of interest challenge prevailing notions of crisis used by Africanist historians?
Yeah, so I definitely felt a little shy putting that conclusion out there, because I think that, on a different day I could write something very different. But I thought talking about failure is kind of felt a bit like a third rail in African history. And there's good reasons for that, which I talk about in the conclusion, that in civilizational narratives, the sort of slotting of African peoples and the continent as sort of quote unquote failures in different ways is extremely problematic. And African history as a discipline is essential in rewriting that history and correcting that. And to focus on failure also, tends to fulfill the expectations of what people consume in the West via media about Africa, right? That it is a bunch of failed states, and that, failure is just kind of, in the water or something, right? So there's all these reasons why I think failure should be handled incredibly carefully and thoughtfully, as a word, as something to focus on. But I think what I was interested in was kind of contrasting failure with crisis. And for me, crisis is a word that tends to be a bit paralyzing. Crisis is something that is usually this kind of big catastrophe that happens, where experts and expert knowledge come in to intervene and to diagnose what went wrong and to try and fix it. and that crisis is about building a narrative that sort of justifies the ends. That's not how I think necessarily African historians use the term. That's kind of, I think, historically a process that has happened a lot. And so for me, I was wondering if I could think with failure as something that is an ongoing process that happens, whether we like it or not, and how it might actually animate thinking on a different level. So thinking more, as I say, more closer to the ground. So if I'm interested in, the bus system falling apart, or waste not getting picked up, what kinds of stories might I be able to tell if I'm looking at these kinds of everyday obstacles and failures that a kind of larger sort of specter of urban crisis might miss? And what then can we also learn about people on the ground and how they made their lives possible if we put failure more front and center? So I certainly hope my book doesn't come across as a narration of failure, but failure in this kind of quotidian way of living in a city and having to deal with things going offline, and ultimately sort of massive failure of urban systems by the 1980s. How can we maybe come to see the sort of creativity and intelligence of how people make their lives possible by highlighting this?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. It's an overused word, and I think it's a dangerous word, and I think when it's used in the West particularly, it's like there's a crisis, we must intervene in some way, and it's a very it's a tool of you making very paternalistic and interventionist
Right.
attitudes, which I think you are absolutely right to fight against.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for discussing your book with us. Before I let you go, though, I'm absolutely fascinated by the little bit I've heard so far about your forthcoming project, Stories from the Substrate. Basically, this is a final question. Like, what are you working on now? What is Stories from the Substrate? The floor is yours. So tell us what you're working on now.
Yeah, so I'm on research leave at the moment, which is a bit of a farce in these COVID times, because I can't go anywhere and I can't really make it to archives, but I also just had a baby, so that probably wouldn't happen anyways. But nevertheless,
congratulations.
Thank you. I actually think it's kind of been nice that I've not been able to be too ambitious, because it's meant that I've gotten to do a lot of really interesting reading for this next project and to think a lot about the project before I dive into collecting, I guess. So the next project is basically I want to look at East Africa from the soil, like I say, and think about soil. The way I'm framing it for now is that it's actually going to be a media history of soil. And what I mean by that is not a history via newspapers or radio or television, but soil as a medium. So soil as a medium for containing and transferring really important and vital things for life in East Africa. And what I have seen, I think soil comes up a lot in East African history, frequently from the perspective of looking at colonial development projects to try and curb erosion and the political effects of these projects. So, not to be overly glib, but I think soil comes into East African history mostly as soil science. And so what I'm hoping to do with this project is to think about soil in a fair amount of different ways. So having different chapters on things like termites and termite mounds, and how important the soil from termite mounds have been to communities, but also, of course, the termite as a kind of pest of empire chapters on the salt gardens of Katwe in Western Uganda that are cultivated and have been for hundreds of years and produce soil that has really high sodium content and is used to make salt. Or looking at the kaolin deposits outside of Dar es Salaam that are mined and used for making pottery, and in fact calpectates, so something that is used to soothe upset stomachs. And sand mining along the coast of Kenya, and sort of how that sand is then being transported into Nairobi to be used for building projects. So the actual, kind of use and consumption of soil in all of these different ways to sustain life in the region. And because soil, I think, is such an important thing that's getting a lot of attention right now in the era of climate change. It's become this sort of, a lot of hopes are being buried in the soil right now about its capacity to be a sink for carbon, among other things. So that's the kind of short description of what I hope the project becomes. Of course, there's a lot of metaphorical richness in soil too. So that makes sense in the context of East Africa as well, of claiming to have autochthonous belonging to certain areas, to be of the soil. So I'll be sort of seeking some of that stuff out too.
That sounds wonderful. I really look forward to seeing it come to fruition. For now, that's all we've got time for. Thank you again to Dr. Emily Brownell for joining us today. We'll put some links in the description for this podcast. So if you want to read more of Dr. Brownell's work and to find out more about her book, please click on those. Thank you also to Renee Mandeville, who's been working in the background to make sure this podcast runs smoothly. Thank you to the listener for listening. And once again, my name is Philip Gooding, and you've been listening to the Indian Ocean World podcast.
The Indian Ocean World podcast would like to acknowledge the generous support of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. This podcast series is part of the SSHRC-funded partnership project Appraising Risk, Past and Present, interrogating historical data to enhance understanding of environmental crises in the Indian Ocean world.